South Africa's Home Affairs Minister has extended the validity of Zimbabwean exemption permits until June 30, 2023. The permits are meant to regularize the presence of Zimbabweans and allow them access such services as banking. The permits were also set to expire at the end of this year after being previously extended. So far, it is estimated that just about 6,000 of the 178,000 permit holders affected have responded to the minister's call to state their case before the expiration of the permit. The department was responding to an application by the Helen Suzman Foundation, which took the government to court over its decision not to extend the exemption permit. Now joining me from Johannesburg, South Africa is Dr. Kudakwashe Vanyoro. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the Africa Center for Migration and Society. Dr. Vanyoro, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Good day to you and your viewers. Thanks for having me.
So let's get a bit of a background on this situation. So how did the Zimbabwe exemption permits come about for the South African government?
Yeah, that's an important question. So, I mean, as many people would know, the Zimbabwean crisis of around 2007, 2008 prompted a sort of mass exodus of Zimbabwean migrants leaving the country to go and seek better opportunities elsewhere in neighboring countries such as Botswana, Mozambique, and South Africa, which hosted a significant number of that population. So this situation was really a difficult moment in the sense that many of these migrants would move undocumented because, to begin with, the cost of passports were quite high at the time, as well as the fact that there wasn't really any visa regime to address, to regularize them. So this raised the need for a particular criteria for them, which would allow people who didn't have passports, who were undocumented at the time without any visas, to get some kind of amnesty to allow them to work. And this was in response to mounting pressure from a lot of civil society groups that were really concerned about the plight of Zimbabwean migrants, particularly as it heightened their vulnerabilities, including as well in the labor market. So the government eventually had to put together this exemption permit system, which has been in existence since 2009, 2010, thereabouts.
So this is about a decade after the exemption permit has been in place. So how successful would you say it's been? And initially, how long was it meant to last? Because it's now extending into 2023, but it had been, I think, about a decade or 10 years that it was meant to last. And in terms of also the economic integration of the individuals who hold this permit, how successful has that been?
It's been a very useful protection mechanism in terms of providing regularization, documentation, which is very necessary to protect migrants who are coming from Zimbabwe. For example, one of the issues has to do with labor protections. Vulnerability related to wages, for example, comes from the fact that people don't have papers, right? So once you give them the papers, you allow them to be somewhat competitive in the labor market and to have rights, to be able to unionize. So all of that, to be able to access social services without really much difficulty, at least as compared to people who are undocumented. But the amnesty wasn't as far-reaching as perhaps it could have been. So, and I suppose, like your question is important about how long this would have been. It was initially meant to be a 4-year dispensation, which would not allow the beneficiaries to claim, so for example, permanent residency on the basis of length of stay in the country. So it did come with some benefits, but to some extent, it also was quite prohibitive in terms of how far it could go.
And we have to look at this in terms of how far the extension is going, as you said now, because the issues that Zimbabwe is experiencing are continuing. The country is still in the midst of inflation, now in the triple digits again. Sanctions are still in place from the West, and you still have an economy that is struggling. So even though this is 6 years over the initial time period and with another extension in place, does it go as far as it needs to? Because we've heard from the Zimbabwe community in South Africa, which has argued that it is not, in fact, enough. So on the economic side of things, because we've seen many of the Zimbabwe permit holders being involved in the hospitality industry, and the Federated Hospitality Association of South Africa has welcomed the 6-month extension, how much further do you think South Africa can go with this?
That's an important question. The mainstreaming, at least, or streamlining of this visa regime would have been something that would have been, I think, beneficial, because you can only keep people temporary for so long. And I think these are the exact moments where every time that this has to come to an end, there's always contestations around it. And these are not only contestations, and these contestations are not, first of all, the internal contestations around disgruntled South Africans that do feel that this permit needs to come to an end. But they're also connected to disgruntlements around the geopolitical issues in the SADC region, around Zimbabwe's own role and responsibility around the plight of the migrants in question. So there is a governance issue here that is at stake, that also includes and indicts the Zimbabwean government. And one of the reports around why there's been so much pushback around the extension is that Zimbabwe on its own feels that it's ready somewhat to take back some of these migrants to come to the country. And so when the South African delegation visited Zimbabwe to hold some kind of intervention or talks, the Zimbabwean diplomacy mentioned that they would like to see a situation where the permits are not necessarily extended, because, as you can imagine, this has an influence on the perception of the country that is trying to present itself as somewhat a new dispensation in and of itself, with the emergence of President Emmerson Mnangagwa as the incumbent leader.
Okay, so let's pick up from there a little bit, because depending on who you ask, and I think we will probably agree on this, the Zimbabwean community is thought to be the largest non-indigent community in South Africa. And whether you stop the permits right now or you stop it next year, there is some kind of anticipated impact. What do you think that impact will be, especially economically, given again that the number of these individuals who hold the permits are really, really quite well integrated into South Africa's hospitality sector?
The impacts are obviously on the welfare of these migrants. I suppose, to be fair to the South African government, the Department of Home Affairs has made a provision that these migrants who are under this dispensation must now move to another mainstream documentation system. But the labor migration system in South Africa doesn't really is not comprehensive enough, particularly at the level of low skills, for example, to be able to ensure that one moves from particularly, let's say, someone working in domestic work or hospitality or in agriculture, or even people who are driving Ubers, who are working in the transport industry, who may have these permits. It's not necessarily easy for them to move into the, for example, work visa, particularly the fact that this work is not recognized as critical work, so they wouldn't be able as well to go into a critical work permit, for example. So there are a lot of difficulties around the transition into another permit, which eventually means that people are most likely going to go underground, that is undetectable and undocumented, which becomes a contradictory scenario around for those populist movements that are calling for example, the complete removal of this permit regime. One example, for example, is the Operation Dudula movement that has been gaining traction around this issue.
All right, Dr. Vanyoro, thank you so much for your time. It is an interesting one there. There are some who say that there may be a further extension when June 2023 comes around, but we'll see what happens between now and then and look into the matter in the future. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And the Zimbabwe exemption permit is one that continues to generate controversy in South Africa. As my guest did mention, Operation Dudula is one of the groups in South Africa that has said that immigrants, or rather illegal migrants from other African countries, are taking jobs and ruining the country. And it's one conversation that we'll continue to keep our eye on. You're watching Business Edge. It is a Wednesday, which means we have women in business coming up. And in Africa, tourism and travel are big business. When we come back from the break, how are women in this sector doing? We'll find out. Stick around.